Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore. My name is Alex. I'm the program director here at the bookstore. Thank you for joining us this evening. We're delighted you're here. We hope you feel safe and we hope you enjoy tonight's program with Alex Marr and Todd Allen. Before we begin, some quick housekeeping notes as always. First, we have announced many events over the next few months, and we've even printed out a one-page flyer for you to take home. It is all of our confirmed events through April and May. They're up at the front table as you enter or exit. So please take one home with you so you can come back for another event. I'd like to take a moment to just plug one upcoming event we're particularly excited for. On Tuesday, May 23rd at 7 p.m., Messiah University professor Drew Hart will interview author Jonathan Eig on his new biography of Martin Luther King Jr. titled King, A Life. It's the first full biography of MLK in decades, so we hope to see you there at that event. Lastly, before we get started tonight, if you haven't yet purchased a copy of 70 × 7, I encourage you to purchase a copy through the Midtown Scholar Bookstore and get it signed after the event. Book sales are the bedrock of sustainability for our free author events, and we appreciate your support of Alex and the bookstore. But now I'm happy to introduce our speakers for this evening's program. Our interviewer this evening is Todd Allen. Todd is the Vice President of Diversity Affairs at Messiah University. He is the founder of the Common Ground Project, a nonprofit dedicated to teaching the history of the civil rights movement. For the past 21 years, in partnership with the PNC Foundation, Allen has led the Returning to the Roots of Civil Rights bus tour. He's a frequent lecturer on commemorative practices, public memory related to the civil rights movement. Of course, our featured author tonight is Alex Marr. Alex is the author of Witches of America, which was a New York Times notable book of 2015. Her work has appeared in New York Magazine, Wired, the New York Times Book Review, and The Guardian, among many other outlets, as well as the Best American Magazine Writing. She was a finalist for the National Magazine Award in Feature Writing in 2018. She is also the director of the feature-length documentary American Mystic. She lives in the Hudson Valley and New York City. Of course, Alex's new book that we are here for this evening is titled 70 × 7, A True Story of Murder and Mercy. I've got to read just one blurb from author Sierra Kane, who writes, quote, 70 × 7 is a devastating and essential book, a meticulous deconstruction of the social fears and personal calculations that built and still uphold the death penalty in America. A brilliant reporter and empathetic narrator, Alex Marr has written the truest kind of crime drama, unafraid of rendering our narratives about justice less comforting, end quote. It's an honor to host Alex and Todd this evening. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage, Alex Marr and Todd Allen.
Thank you so much for being here. I just was talking about what a gorgeous bookstore this is. There's so much here that I was tempted to sneak away into the stacks before the reading, ran out of time. It's also my very first time in Harrisburg, and everyone's made me feel very welcome. So that's really been something special. Before we start our conversation, I would just like to read a passage from the book. 2 short passages. One question that comes up when you center a story around a violent crime, I think, is this question of when do you introduce the crime itself? Because the moment at which you introduce that act of violence, it really has an impact on how much empathy the reader is willing to have for any of the characters involved. So I instead chose to open the book after the prologue with a moment a few years back in time. So the crime at the center of this book took place in 1985. 15-year-old Paula Cooper murdered an elderly woman, Ruth Pelke, in her home in a sort of robbery gone wrong. She was then sentenced to death for the crime, and incredible events took place in the aftermath of that sentence. But instead of 1985, I opened the book in 1979 when Paula was actually just 9 years old. So this is a scene, it's a moment from her childhood that I think lets the reader know something important about what her childhood was like. One house of the many that make up a city, a pale yellow house, an hour after sunup in Gary, Indiana. A woman lives here on Wisconsin Street with her 2 daughters. Rhonda is 12, her sister Paula is 9. It is 1979. Their mother, her name is Gloria, hustles them outside into the morning light and then into the dark of the garage and the back seat of her red Chevy Vega. The girls are very young and they are powerfully tired. They understand what their mother intends to do. She has kept them up all night, softly talking, then shouting, then whimpering to them about where they'll be traveling together, about what must happen next. And they are no longer resistant. With her daughters inside, Gloria tugs at the garage door until it slides down to meet the concrete. She slips into the driver's side, rolls down the windows, turns the key in the ignition. The engine gives off a deep, thrumming sound. Then she waits for them to close their eyes and fall into that steady rhythm. She can see their faces in the rearview mirror, small and brown and perfect. All three are still, their limbs grown heavy as if underwater. The engine continues running, the minutes accumulate, the air thickens. Outside the garage, the neighborhood is awakening. Inside the garage, the girls are passing into an unnatural sleep. What Rhonda remembers next, she and Paula laying side by side on their bottom bunk, not knowing how they got there. They have not exited the world. Gloria is leaning over them, her daughters. They will be all right, she says, just before leaving. Rhonda does not know how much time has passed before she is able to move her body. She rises slowly. A letter is taped to the door from their mother. She is finishing what she set out to do. Rhonda rushes to the kitchen and calls her aunt, who tells her to run, get their neighbor. Through the window, she thinks she sees exhaust seeping out from under the garage door into the bright daylight. Mr. Hollis drags Gloria out of the garage and lays her on her back on the lawn. He drops to his knees and with elbows locked, hand over hand, pushes hard on her chest again and again. The neighbor across the street, a nurse, rushes over and takes her turn trying to pump breath into Gloria's body. The ambulance arrives and the fire department, and a medic becomes the third person in line to tend to Gloria. By now, Paula is standing outside watching. Rhonda sees her younger sister grow hysterical at the sight of this stranger bearing down on their mother's chest, and Gloria not responding, not responding. Something Rhonda will not forget. No one examines them. The girls, the firemen, the medics, no one so much as takes their pulse. When Gloria is swept off to the hospital, the sisters go stay with their aunt. When after a week their mother checks herself out early, no one asks any questions. When she comes to retrieve her daughters, no one stops her. For years, Rhonda has said that she does not know what transformed her sister. But now she tells me, as if untangling the question aloud, that this was it. This must have been the start of a change in Paula. Because you have to understand, we were all supposed to have been dead. That's what we were expecting. That's what we were hoping. But they were still alive. And what now? Another day in the yellow house? So the book then goes on to describe, you get a sense of the larger community in Gary, Indiana, and you get a sense of also the life of Ruth Pelke, who ultimately loses her life. She's the victim in this story. And I describe the crime when Paula and three other girls, 14, 15, 16 years old, talk their way into her house, and Paula killed Mrs. Pelke. We go through some of the sentencing hearings, and ultimately Paula is sentenced to death, as I mentioned. I'm going to skip ahead now to a moment that for me really drew me into this story and decided, it really made me decide that I wanted to spend years looking into this case. What happened is Ruth Pelke's grandson, who was a steel worker in his late 30s, just a man who minded his own business, had no particular habit of making political statements or anything of the sort, decided to publicly forgive Paula for killing his grandmother. And this was against the wishes of his family, his friends. I mean, everyone he knew thought he had lost it. So I'll just give you a little passage from the night where he made that decision. He was called in for a late shift at the steel mill. He was a crane operator. So picture him in this warehouse where it's dark, it's empty. He's the only guy on this shift right now. He's waiting for instructions from his boss. So he's alone in this crane cab, hovering over this dark space. And he realizes in that moment, it's been months now since the death sentence was handed down to Paula. He realizes that his life is a mess. He's grieving for his grandmother. His girlfriend has left him. His family and him are having some issues. He's just declared bankruptcy and he has no direction in his life. So in this moment of feeling so lost, he starts to cry. You know, this grown man in his workplace starts to cry, and he pictures Paula Cooper for the first time in months. And he thinks, this is a girl who is someone far more desperate and alone than I will ever be. So that sets off a series of thoughts. Seeing Paula Cooper in person that day in the courthouse, he'd been struck by how young she looked. Just turned 16, 23 years younger than him. She was a girl. And immediately after her sentence was read, that man, the girl's grandfather, the only grown family that had shown up, the way he had called out, the way he had lost it, and how a guard had escorted the old man down the aisle right past Bill, still calling out about his grandbaby, wretched. Paula was let out next. The front of her prison smock darkened with tears, head bobbing, her eyes darting from side to side as if looking for the person who might appear at any moment to help her. He starts to think here of an image that's been in the press of his grandmother. Ruth Pelke, with a ring of soft, silvery white curls around her head, high cheekbones, a beatific half smile. She wears pink lipstick, cat's eye glasses, and silver earrings the size of coat buttons. At this moment, the image he holds in his mind begins to transform. His grandmother's eyes begin to shine. They're wet, and tears begin a steady, clear runoff down her cheeks. Her face remains still, frozen in that day in the portrait studio, but the photograph is weeping. Ruth Pelke has become like one of the weeping statues of the Virgin Mary, those figures discovered in so many countries leaking tears of blood or oil or scented water, receiving thousands of visitors desperate for a demonstration of truth. Or else her tears are in the likeness of the Son, of Jesus in Bethany crying over the death of Lazarus. Jesus wept. This too is a lamentation. The photograph is weeping because here is a woman in pain. Ruth hurts from the memory of her death, from the final 30 minutes of her life. But that's not it. No. It seems to Bill in this moment that Ruth's feelings are passed to him, that they flood his chest. And he believes, he understands, she is crying for that girl, for Paula Cooper, for the girl's grandfather. She would not have wanted him to suffer the knowledge that his grandchild will be buckled into a chair and her body overwhelmed by electrical current. And she would not want this girl to be killed for killing her, to be killed in her name. Bill thinks of what Jesus said when the Romans raised him up on the cross. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. For the first time, he believes it is possible that the girl did not know what she was doing when she killed Ruth, that she'd been out of her right mind, that a blind anger must have propelled her forward. And now his grandmother is calling on him to forgive her. His grandmother is calling on him. Is this a calling? Almost 30 years since he first dreamt of such a moment, Bill Pelke is being called. At first, the revelation is a notion. It infuses no part of his body. It changes nothing about his instincts toward the girl. Those remain cool and hard. Bill has decided to forgive her, to have compassion, but he has none to give. And he knows that if he cannot find that store of empathy sunk deep inside of him, then from this point on, whenever he pictures his grandmother, he will feel that he failed her. Eventually, he will shut her image out. Bill begins again to pray, the way a desperate person forms words, unable to prevent them slipping from his lips. He prays for God to make him love Paula Cooper, to flood him with it. And he waits. He waits. And inevitably, this comes to him. If that girl is worth forgiving, if even his grandmother can feel compassion for her, can wish for her protection, then he must be too, though he has also, in his own way, fucked things up beyond repair. Bill himself must be worth preserving. In the quiet of the mill, high above the dead machines, Bill considers what he will do. He will write Paula a letter. And in that letter, he will tell her about his grandmother and about God's forgiveness and how Jesus loves her just as he loves every person who ever walked the earth. And he parses them out, the words he will write. And Bill can see a way forward. He can imagine her just maybe writing back. And in his head, this becomes a real correspondence. And truly, he wants to know what she might say to him, not by way of explanation for what she's done, but as proof of humanness, of consciousness in a concrete box on death row. And Bill realizes he does not want to see this girl die. There it is, compassion. This is enough to forgive. He has forgiven her already. He will tell the story of this night for the next 30 years. For some with whom he shares it, the story will recall a passage in the Gospel of John in which Jesus, upon learning of the death of one of his followers, begins to weep. And then he approaches the tomb and asks that it be opened, and he calls for the man to come out. Inside the tomb, the dead man sits up and then stands and then steps outside. His hands and feet are wrapped in linen. His face is covered. Jesus says to the crowd, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." To be released from the threat of the death house would make of Paula Cooper another kind of Lazarus. And she and Bill both, they would take off their grave clothes.
You can clap for that.
Thank you.
Alex, welcome to the Midtown Scholar and to Harrisburg. Just before we get underway with my questions, I want to have a moment of full disclosure. Alex and I just met, but in the dedication, you say the book is for Todd, and then you arrived.
Clearly, I foresaw this night.
So, but you know, after reading this story, and I'm so glad that you shared those two excerpts, because there are so many people and whose stories are in this account, and it highlights the ways in which not only are the lives of the victim and the perpetrator intertwined, but the lives of their family and friends are forever transformed and interconnected. Now, you just told us kind of why this story, but I'm curious to know, how did you come to this story? And you say that you were working on this for a long time. What is a long time?
Oh, 5 years, which, occasionally books do take that long when there's a lot of research involved, and yet you always think you're the one who'll do it faster. But I will say I was doing some research on a hunch because I also write long form stories for magazines, and I'm always wondering where the next story will come from. I was doing some research into cases of violent crimes committed by women specifically, because it's far more rare than violent crimes committed by men. And I wanted to understand what kind of patterns we might see. And so in just going through a lot of case summaries, I mean, hundreds and hundreds, I stumbled across the story of Ruth Pelke's murder. And it just stopped me in my tracks. And part of it was Paula's age, the fact that she was 15 and that she was then sentenced to death for that crime committed at 15. And then the forgiveness piece, how a few months later, the victim's grandson chooses to publicly forgive her. And I had never heard of something like that. I really thought, I think I'm basically a good person, but I don't know what is that moment all about? And so I managed to dig up Bill Pelke's phone number somehow, and I just gave him a call and introduced myself and said, do you have a moment? I really want to ask you what was behind that decision all those years ago. And by the time I got off the phone, I just knew in my gut that I'd be exploring this for a long time.
Thinking of the people in this story, I had originally almost said characters. These are people in this story. I can't ask you about everybody I want to ask you about, but I want to ask you about a couple. And I want to actually begin with Ruth. She's a character or person that we meet through her testimony, through the testimony of others, through this brutal act, right? Yet her voice, and particularly her Christian witness, looms large in this story. As you just shared about that transformative moment for Bill. How did the life and legacy of Ruth influence the narrative?
I definitely wanted to, there's the sense that, Paula Paula and Bill's relationship is the dynamic kind of heart of this book. But I wanted to make sure that we understood how heinous the crime was, and also that there was a real human being who is no longer capable of sharing her story, and so I talked to family members. I actually tracked down the spot where Ruth grew up in rural Indiana, the Brethren Church in which she was raised, and her parents were founding members. I just tried to find as many people who had known her. I actually found a woman who was 102 years old in a senior center who had been taught Bible study by Ruth when they were growing up together, and she remembered a hymn that I mentioned in the book. That was a hymn that Ruth taught the young kids. I wanted to make her a full person. And what's incredible about her, and you get to know her in one of the earlier chapters, and she comes up again, but I wanted her to have that early impact so you would remember her. But what's great about her, she was so driven to work with kids of all kinds. And I discovered, and even her grandkids didn't know this when I mentioned it, that as a young person, she had a brother who was a couple years younger. And since this was earlier in the 1900s, her brother died suddenly. And there was no record of what he died of. Maybe it was a sudden sickness. But I just imagined, maybe she was really close to her younger brother and she lost him. And because she spent the rest of her life around kids who were very young. And, so she was important to me. And she was also important as a contrast to Bill, because when we first meet Bill, he is a hot mess. He was raised with a lot of, faith that he then began to question. He loved the ladies. He wanted to have a good time in college. He just wasn't sure what his direction was going to be in life. But he he kind of returned to his grandmother's values in a way after her death.
You say early on, quote, "There's no question of her guilt," referring to Paula. "This is not a story of wrongful conviction." As I prepare to ask you about Paula, what would you say then this is a story about?
Well, I wanted to make clear in the prologue, really, that there's no doubt as to who committed the crime. This is not that kind of story. I think we were conditioned a little bit by true crime to think, there's an angle like that. I wanted to do something that I thought was kind of tough, which was to confront the reader with, here's a young person. She really committed this terrible act. Absolutely. Now, what do you want to do about that? If you were there and if it were somehow your decision, if you were the prosecutor or the victim's family member, what would you have said was justice in that scenario? The crime is terrible, but she's also a kid. And so when Bill then chooses to forgive, to me, that's kind of a challenge to the reader. And it was a challenge to me. And that's the origin of the title of the book, which is a reference 70 times 7 to a passage in the Bible about forgiveness. That I think, that's kind of the tough question in the middle of this book. Are you capable of that kind of mercy? And is there room for that kind of mercy in our system?
I promised you before we took the stage, no spoilers. But about Paula, I want to just read from your text here about one of the character witnesses, and here's what they said about her, and then I have a follow-up question to it. The witness says, "Well, I came here to testify for Paula's character, or whatever it is, okay? I didn't come here to justify what Paula did was wrong. Mrs. Pelke and her family is hurt real bad, okay? I understand that. But the child was hurt too, She never had the opportunity that any normal child had. She used to ask me on occasion, she said, I just want to be like the other little kids. I just want to be like the other little kids. This is what the child asked. I think maybe she needs to be punished, but didn't the system some kind of way let this child down?" My question is, do you agree with that assessment? And if so, in what way or what ways did the system let Paula down? And what systems?
Well, I mean, I included that moment from the sentencing hearing because I thought it was so powerful. She and her sister, as you heard in that opening passage, right? They grew up in a very volatile household. The mother clearly had certain mental health issues. She was an alcoholic and it was undealt with. The father was physically abusive. And they ran away from home a number of times and asked for help. They asked for help from the social worker. They asked for help. They were put in an emergency shelter, foster care. They were always sent back home. It was always a temporary solution. So, there's even a moment later in her sentencing where Paula is finally given a chance to speak out on her own behalf right before the judge is going to finally pass down his sentence. And one of the things she says is, where were all of you? And it's clear to me, based on, what I learned and what we've set up in the story before that that's what she's referring to. Everyone is so concerned about her now that she's done this extreme act, but her, no one was checking in on these kids in the way that was appropriate. So in that sense, I think the system let her down. And I think ultimately, when we have a system where you can sentence kids to death, or what we do now, which we sentence kids to die in prison, essentially life without parole, right? What does that say about our hope for rehabilitation or for people to be transformed? Those kids are going to be incarcerated for decades. You don't think there's an outside chance any of them are going to mature and have something to offer? So I don't get on any kind of soapbox in this book. I really made an effort to show both sides of a lot of these arguments because these are tough questions. But the story does connect all the way up to the end of the death penalty for kids in this country, which was only in 2005. I mean, that's pretty recent. So you see how this case actually connects up to that moment, which I thought was pretty thrilling to map out.
And that was one of the things that was shocking to me, that there was such little outcry when she was sentenced to death. And I won't ruin it from there, but I want to talk about Bill, who once was a hot mess and then had that transformative moment that you talked about. When I think about Bill and then ultimately his relationship with Paula, I see this tension between forgiving, right? And I'm wondering, how was this a time of healing? Was it a time of healing for Bill? But then also then the tension for Paula of being forgiven, feeling like you're worth and worthy of forgiveness. I wonder if you could speak to either one of those.
Well, one thing that was incredible about the process of researching this is, it was in the reading I gave where Bill has this idea, oh, okay, I guess I'll just write this girl a letter, which is sort of a, okay, it's a bold move. So the next day, he sits down at work and he takes some paper out of his foreman's office and a ballpoint pen, and he just sits and he thinks, okay, what am I going to say to this girl who killed my grandmother? And it started a correspondence between them. And I got to read hundreds and hundreds of letters between the two of them that mapped out this relationship that started when she was 16 and he was 40 and continued for a long time. And at first, with this announcement of Bill's forgiveness, Paula's response was actually one of anger. She was an overwhelmed, terrified kid on death row, and all she could think was, you and your family wanted me to die, so good for you. Here I am right now. And I think she was suspicious of this man as well, because as her older sister Rhonda said to her, who forgives like that? Who does that? There's a great scene where she learns that Bill is now also writing their grandfather and saying, oh, I want to come and visit. And she, no, he is not. I'm not going to be here for that. Absolutely. And Bill, when Bill visits their family, he leaves a fruit basket as a gift. And Rhonda comes over and she goes, is that from that man? Don't eat that fruit. I'm not going to eat that fruit. Don't touch that apple. You don't know what's in that. So sort of these moments of levity, but really it's about these two families, one on either side of this terrible crime. They have been made to feel that the last thing they can do is trust each other, right? Even though ultimately the book starts to show, well, you know what, maybe Rhonda and Bill have a lot more in common than they're aware of at first. But eventually, Bill, in coming back, writing again, offering his friendship to Paula, she takes it and she thinks, you know what, this is really a comfort and I feel like I can trust this man. And he becomes part of a much larger campaign to spare her life that goes all the way to Europe. And just as a teaser, eventually involves Pope John Paul II. I mean, it's really an unexpected twist at a certain point, but
Yeah, I love that moment when Rhonda was talking to her grandfather, and like you said, don't touch that. I was like, I could see that. And I might be thinking that same thing. I know the book has only been out now for a few days, but you're going to be heading to Indiana soon. What do you think the response is going to be to this story? I mean, I'm assuming maybe that family members, Pelkes, maybe Rhonda have had a chance to read it. Others in the state maybe looking at it.
So a number of folks related to the story have read it and feel good about it. I think it's challenging to have your story and your life written about, because what sums up a life, right? And it's kind of a surreal experience, but people have responded well so far to the book. I'm actually giving a reading near Gary as one of my first stops, and Rhonda will be there. She wrote me a note, I want to be there. And a couple of the Pelke family members, and even the prosecutor, who is a controversial character in the book, because the prosecutor in this case in Lake County, he ended up being prosecutor for 10 years. He went for the death penalty for 2 of the 4 girls, even though they were teenagers. He went for the death penalty 22 times during his term as prosecutor. And he loves the book. So even though I think, he's a complex, controversial character, but he thought that it showed different dimensions to the story, and he was good with it.
I've heard you describe the book as a moral challenge for the reader. I'm wondering, in what ways did this book challenge you? And does it still challenge you?
Oh, I mean, I'm worn out after 5 years of this. Are you kidding me? It's an intense story, right? And I ultimately I did the math, and I interviewed probably about 80 people for this book. A core group of them I was seeing in person over and over again. And it's a lot of weight, the responsibility of wanting to tell accurately someone's story, to get the details right, and to have everyone feel like they were respected, so but in terms of the moral challenge, honestly, one of the biggest things for me, biggest revelation, was this business of it with any crime in any courtroom, there is a family on either side of that case, on either side of that room, and we are so trained not to think about it that way. And those families often have some kind of common humanity. But the way the system works is the prosecutor tells a certain story. He's going for a certain kind of sentence. For the families to talk to each other across the aisle just complicates things. That is the way the system is structured. And this really brought that home. And it raised for me some questions about, how does that maybe apply in our regular lives too? Where not communicating with what we think is the other side is maybe prolonging an issue. So that to me was a challenging thing to wrestle with.
I think I've got time for one more question before we turn it over to the audience. And that would be, what is your hope for this book?
I hope people will read it with an open mind and really let themselves get close to all of these different characters and think in a complex way about what they might have chosen to do. Because for me, my feelings, my answer to that changed every few months working on this book, and I think that if someone like Bill can have empathy for Paula, if someone like Rhonda can say, I'm going to stick by my sister in spite of the situation, in spite of what it's going to cost me, I think it's a challenge to have greater empathy, or to try to have greater empathy in complicated situations.
Thank you so much.
Can we give Todd and Alex a round of applause? So we're going to transition to audience Q&A. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand and I'll come around with the mic. Yes.
I realized that you wrote the book about the one young girl who did the killing. And I was wondering what happened to the other 3 young girls, because under what's called the felony murder doctrine, they could also have been, and maybe they were charged with murder also. And I wanted to know what happened to them.
That is something I address in the book. In the early chapters, you see them go through the system too. So the youngest one was 14. She needed a booster seat to sit on, to be on the stand. I mean, these were, teenage kids. They were all sentenced to long terms, 20-something years, 30-something, 60 years. But Paula was the only one who received the death sentence, because her involvement was more serious. She committed the crime, the murder.
Other questions?
Gotta have questions. I've got more. We gave you time.
I've got a question. Your first book was Witches of America, and now you've had this book. What in particular, what draws you to the stories that you decide to write?
Ooh, good question. you know, something that's a recurring theme I realized in my work, whether it's magazine pieces or it's Witches of America or a documentary I made, American Mystic, this book, I'm so curious about the belief systems that drive our lives, right? That give our lives structure in an extreme situation like this family ended up in, both families, right? How do you decide to respond? Is it based on the faith you were raised with? Maybe it's a faith you converted into. Maybe it's the letter of the law. Maybe it's something your mom used to tell you when you were a kid and that always seemed true to you. You know, what is it that determines how you respond? So the prosecutor in this case was Catholic, but pro-death penalty, and he was fine with that. Bill's family was Baptist, and therefore they wanted retribution. He interpreted his faith as saying the opposite. You know, so with Witches of America, that was an exploration of the pagan new religious movement around the country. I'm fascinated with those bigger questions and how they insert themselves into our otherwise kind of practical daily lives.
When you reached out to Bill, had he not wanted to talk, you wouldn't have a book. Was there ever anyone in the story that you contacted that was not on board with you writing a book? As you said, you mentioned some people who are very, complimentary towards you now that the book has been published. But was there anyone that was not on board that maybe you had to convince to be in the book? And is there anyone that you wanted to be in the book that said, no, I don't want to be in there?
There were a couple of people who are now deceased, and so I lost the opportunity. You know, there was no opportunity. So the judge in Paula's case, I would have loved to have spoken to. But you know, Rhonda, I was afraid to really approach for years because I had been warned by people who knew her that she'd been traumatized at the time. She was hounded by newspaper reporters. She got lots of nasty phone calls. You know, she really had a hard time in the wake of her sister's arrest. And about 3 years into the process, after writing her and then kind of talking to friends of hers, I was told, okay, you know, I think it's okay. You know, we'll do an introduction. I think this might be better timing. She's feeling, you know, like she's in a good place. And we ended up talking a great deal. And, you know, we're very friendly now. And I think she's an incredible person. But that was a huge gift because I was able to understand pieces of the story that I would never have otherwise known about. And then one other person early on was Monica Foster, who was one of the appellate attorneys on Paula's case, who's whip smart, amazing. She's now the federal public defender of Indiana. She's been doing these kinds of really tough cases for ages. I called her on the phone early on. She was all for it. And then I could never get her on the phone again. No emails, no phone calls. And it was really early on. And I thought, if I can't get her, she's so integral to this story, it's got to be a bad sign. So I bought a ticket to Indianapolis where her office was so that I could casually show up and say to her receptionist, well, you know, I'm in town for some things. And is she in? And so she saw me and I knew, okay, all right, we're fine. But she's aware of that lie now.
Did they do a psychological profile on Paula?
They did, yeah. They had, and someone, the psychiatrist testified during the sentencing hearing. You know, it's interesting because in spite of the profile they created, where they said, you know, she does not necessarily show signs of an anti-social personality or a sociopathic personality. It was very vague, you know. They made a note of her chaotic childhood, but to my mind, you know, this is someone who showed clear signs of depression. Many people said that. it just, I don't think we had the information about mental health in 1985 that we have now. And that was one of the issues. And a juvenile court judge who knew her case in Lake County at the time spoke with her all these years later. And she agreed, it was just, we didn't have the kind of sophisticated understanding of mental health, if we have that now, but it was less so in the 80s.
But that was a very vengeful act she did, stabbing someone 33 times. That's very personal, stabbing to begin with, let alone 33 times.
There was a theory, and her sister agreed with this. She had a conversation with Paula about it. Whether or not it's true, Paul at one point said to her, I felt that I was stabbing one of our parents.
That's what I
Yeah.
thought.
And I don't, and again, I don't know if that's true, but that was an idea that was floated.
Would you say that this story is more challenging to someone, morally challenging to someone who's a Christian, who has a Christian background, or one who's more politically charged? Because I'm thinking of the two driving elements in the story, the death penalty and then forgiveness. So I'm just wondering, like, if someone were to read this book and they're a Christian, would they say, yeah, you should forgive, or if you're politically charged, you're like, no, absolutely not. Or will it tug at both sides?
I can't really predict how people are going to respond. What I tried to do is raise these questions and describe these scenarios, and I hope give the reader space to wrestle with that. For Bill, as you saw in that passage that I read, his faith was closely connected ultimately to his decision to forgive. But there are other characters in the book you meet later where they're not particularly Christian. And also, whether you're a Baptist or a Catholic or a Church of the Brethren member, there's so many different stripes of Christian in the book, but they all have different feelings when it comes to the death penalty, with criminal justice. And, there's also that question of, can you subscribe to the kind of tough on crime approach that can be very popular in this country and still say, but I am a Christian, I am merciful, I read the Bible? Some people would say, sure. Others, no, that's contradictory, right? So I tried to just sort of tease that out and get it to the surface with the different characters. And then, when you finish reading it, write me a note, let me know what you think.
On a related note, there was a situation here within the last 10 to 15 years called the Nickel Mines tragedy, where there was a man who killed a number of students, Amish school children. And the Amish community responded by forgiving. And so there was a book written called Amish Grace, where they talked about how for the Amish, that was tied very much into their belief in the Lord's Prayer. So you talked about how, I'm sorry, is it Ben? Bill, that was tied into his faith. I have two questions. The first is, what did forgiveness mean to him? And the second question is, what are some lessons that you learned about forgiveness that could possibly be, or lessons that we might get from the book?
I think for Bill, what forgiveness did was it allowed him to create meaning and something positive about within a terrible tragedy that had befallen his family, right? Because then it became a story of compassion, of trying to figure out, well, what happened with this young girl? Can I help her? Like, let's turn this from a moment of extreme anger into something where maybe we can have another kind of conversation. I really do think that it gave his life a different kind of meaning. But, something that comes up later in the book, even beyond Paula's time on death row, Bill then ends up, through all of the work he does to make people aware of Paula's situation, he ends up meeting one by one other murder victims' family members who chose to speak out against the death sentence in their cases too, who all feel isolated, people in different parts of the country who thought, oh, I'm just a pariah. People think I'm nuts. And they get together. And that's another piece of the book. And what I learned from getting to know a number of those folks is that sometimes the choice to forgive is a means of survival, because a lot of these individuals told me I couldn't hold on to that darkness, that anger, that desire for revenge. It was ruining their lives. So sometimes people forgive for themselves. It's got nothing to do with that other person. And that was really fascinating to me.
Thank you for not giving up after 5 years or at any point
Thank
along
you.
this. You're right. Dang, this is important. I'm wondering if you could identify, I think you said earlier that there were times in the writing where even your own mind was being changed about things. And I'm wondering if you could identify like one of the biggest surprises to yourself personally that you changed your mind about something, and what led up to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. There's not a clear moment, but there were a number of moments where I just felt like I suddenly understood things a lot better, so it was the relationship between Rhonda and Bill, which ends up playing more of a role in the book than I ever expected. That was really surprising to me, what they both ended up representing to and meaning to each other. But then also things like I never thought about the incredible toll on the attorneys who take on this kind of work. And I started to see people in all these different pieces of the process as just a lot more fully human. I don't know how they managed to do this kind of work where you're representing someone who's, up for the death sentence, and it's relentless, overwhelming work. So I just learned so much along the way.
I'm a pastor, and I don't know if I could do what that person did, to be honest with you. I would like to think I could, but that's another thing. My question is specifically, when I saw the book, I haven't read the book, when I saw the book, race. Can you speak to the racial element in the story? Did that ever come out in the trial? Lawyer, the judge, the families? Can you just speak to that?
Oh, absolutely. So first of all, I think a lot of stories about our criminal justice system inevitably involve race, and this was one of those times. I set it up more as a background issue. Gary, Indiana is an incredibly fascinating city. It has an incredible history, but it's a northern industrial town that early on actually was just as segregated as parts of the Jim Crow South. So you had Black workers and families coming up with the Great Migration, thinking great opportunity to get a job, finding that they were in the same crappy situation up north, right? And the city was built to privilege white middle-class executives for the mill, and everyone else who came to get a job, well, good luck to them. You had immigrants from Europe, Black migrants from the South, like I said, and they did not live in the same areas. They didn't have access to the same quality of schooling and housing and so on. That's in the background of this crime, right? And so where Mrs. Pelke lived was a neighborhood called Glen Park that historically was entirely white. At one point, if you were Black, you couldn't pass through the neighborhood unless you had a job to do or something. That had started to change in the years leading up to the crime. But when you had 4 Black girls entering the home of not only an elderly white woman, but a Bible teacher on top of it, the press just lost their minds, right? But it wasn't clear cut in that the tough on crime mentality that was really kicking into gear in the mid 80s Everyone was feeling that. So the Black community in Gary was not protesting at, this death sentence. And, the focus was on the heinousness of the crime rather than the fact of sentencing a teenage kid to death. An interesting note that I mentioned in the book that I was the first one to find this out. The prosecutor, for the sake of optics, looked around and he said, well, Lake County only has one Black criminal court judge, the only one the first one in Indiana history. He should really be the one to try this case, because if we're going for death for these young Black girls, that will just go over better. And he had his deputy prosecutor rig the system so this would end up in Judge Kimbrough's courtroom. And the judge, who did not believe in the death penalty, felt cornered into giving the death sentence because the representation Paula had was so poor. He never recovered from it. But, so that's in the background. It's woven into the story. And it is also part of the relationship between Bill and Paula, Bill and Rhonda, and some of the challenges to building up trust that went beyond the fact of this crime. It was, when Rhonda said, don't eat the fruit that man gives you, she told me, that's because this is an older white man who's been living like 20 minutes away this whole time. He's part of the people who live here keep to themselves. They don't trust us. We don't trust them. What is this forgiveness all about? So it's woven into the book.
Question over here.
I'm just really curious from your all the time that you spent looking at this from I guess there's a criminal justice reform aspect to this that's it's underlying, obviously. And when you look at it, like your thoughts on us as a culture, we're in one hand, we're like crazy safety obsessed. You can't do enough, right? From a safety standpoint. And then at the other side, it's almost barbaric. Of course, we've got minors being charged, and given life sentences. You've got people that are 15, 16, 18, 19 on sex offender registries for the rest of their life, and we've got the whole drug thing, which has been, extreme incarceration. So you try to balance those two, which is, hey, look, there's got to be a softening of this if we want to reintegrate people into society. But then we have this whole safety obsession. Sometimes it's the same people looking for both. I'm just curious what your thoughts are and how do we take steps forward in that, and how's that received?
Yeah, and again, I'm not going to get up on a soapbox, but I will say about this. Oh yes, you are asking me to. It's true. Fair enough. On request, I'll take a request. But this tough on crime approach is, I think, a huge part of the problem. It sells so well. That slogan still plays in 2023, right? It gets people elected. And I think it's based on a fantasy that we have of, if we elect this one individual, they'll come in, they'll swoop in like a knight in shining armor, and they'll be tougher than anyone's ever been, and it's going to clean everything up. But it's already been proven that that kind of approach does not actually have real results. It just, plays off of our emotions and our fantasies. I think it's been proven already that a huge step towards real safety in our communities is on the other end of things, programs that are going to help kids out so that you don't end up in this extreme situation where a kid had been bounced around the system so much that she finally snaps, right? What kind of support do you have in communities in terms of, economic development? So you have a community where there are jobs, where people aren't desperate. They don't have the need to commit crime. But the other side of it too is when people are incarcerated, let's be serious about rehabilitation, because people get out. And then who's coming out the other side? They're coming back into your community. I think there's an idea here that when you imprison someone, they magically poof, disappear or something, and part tied into that also is this issue of race. The tendency to criminalize young people of color more readily than white people of color, white young people. I'm sorry. That's something that we know about. These 4 girls, it was easier in spite of how young they were, and to see them as adults, to try them as adults, and it would have been to do the same with young white girls. We have all this information already. It's all part of the mix. These are big issues, but I do think, you know, the number one thing I would say is rehabilitation, being serious about it, and being suspicious of any time someone uses that sort of tough on crime approach in their campaign.
We are out of time, so can we give Todd and Alex a round of applause?
Thank you, everyone.